The walnut box arrived on a Tuesday, the 14th of October, 1891. It came to the desk of Silas Crowe, Deputy Surveyor for the Vermont State Railway Commission, by way of the Morning Post rider who had traveled through the Green Mountains during the first true cold snap of the season. The kind of cold that does not bite, but rather settles, seeping into the marrow of wooden beams long before it reaches human skin. Crowe was 43 years old, a man who measured the world in chains and links, in the precise mathematics of boundary lines and right-of-ways. He was not a man accustomed to mysteries. He was accustomed to discrepancies. But the box contained a discrepancy that would consume the final months of his career and ultimately his ability to sleep through the night without waking to the sensation of dust in his throat. Inside the box, nestled in straw that smelled faintly of camphor and mildew, lay a surveyor's chain. Not the standardized Gunter's chain of 22 yards that Crowe used in his daily work, but an older variant, 15 links of hand-forged iron, each link stained a dark rust brown that flaked away to reveal blackened metal beneath. 14 of the links were clean. The 15th was twisted, fused at the joint as if subjected to intense heat. Beneath the chain lay a single sheet of linen paper, folded 3 times. The ink was iron gall, turning brown at the edges, written in the cramped, efficient hand of a clerk who had learned his trade copying legal documents. It read, "Mercy Hollow is not abandoned. It was harvested. Check the eastern wall of the company boarding house. The lungs are buried there. Do not trust the map." There was no signature, only the date, March 3rd, 1889. Crowe knew of Mercy Hollow. Every surveyor in the northern tier knew of it, the way one knows of gaps in a fence. It was a granite quarry settlement located in the township of Barr, or rather, it had been located there until the Vermont and Canada Railroad had quietly removed it from their official route maps in the winter of 1888, citing topographical instability. The settlement had housed 437 souls at its peak in 1885. By 1889, it was listed as deserted. The inhabitants dispersed to other mining camps. The quarry flooded. The land reverted to state control. But the chain in Crowe's hands bore the maker's mark of Ezekiel Vance, the granite baron who had owned not only Mercy Hollow, but the medical clinic, the general store, and the only road leading out of the valley. Crowe made the decision to investigate on the same Tuesday. He did not wait for permission from the commission. Surveyors are trained to trust their instruments over their superiors, for a misplaced boundary can destroy a man more thoroughly than a dismissed order. The journey took 3 days. October in Vermont was undergoing its annual transformation from the gentleness of harvest to the brutality of pre-winter. The air held a specific density that year, a weight that pressed against the eardrums, accompanied by a smell Crowe would later describe in his private notes only as the exhalation of wet stone. He traveled by carriage as far as Montpelier, then by wagon along logging roads that grew progressively narrower, the ruts filled with rainwater that reflected not the sky, but the color of old tin. On the 3rd morning, the road ended. Mercy Hollow lay in a natural bowl between 3 granite outcroppings, accessible only by a footpath that switchbacked down through second-growth pine. When Crowe stood at the rim and looked down, he felt the peculiar sensation that surveyors recognize as map sickness, the disorientation that occurs when the terrain refuses to match the cartography. The official maps showed a grid: Main Street, Church Street, the company offices. What Crowe saw was a clearing where the forest had not reclaimed the land, but rather hesitated at its borders, as if unwilling to step onto the soil. The trees stopped 20 yards from the first foundation. Beyond that, a meadow of dead grass, uniformly gray, encircled the remains of 12 structures. No bird song, no movement. The silence had a texture to it, thick and particulate, like breathing through wool. He descended. The temperature dropped as he entered the hollow, not gradually, but in a single step, the way one crosses a threshold into a cellar. His breath began to cloud immediately, though the sun was high and the day was not yet cold enough for frost. The first structure he approached had been the company store. The windows were intact, filmed with a white dust that obscured the interior. When he touched the doorframe, his fingers came away coated in a fine gray powder that smelled of nothing and tasted, when inadvertently he licked his lip, of blood and electricity. Inside the store, the inventory remained. Canned goods swollen with rust lined the shelves. A cat lay desiccated behind the counter, its body preserved not by mummification, but by a coating of the same gray dust that covered every surface. On the wall behind the cash register hung a calendar stopped at February 1889. The month had been crossed out with such violence that the paper had torn, revealing the wall beneath. Crowe's focus, however, was the boarding house. The note had specified the eastern wall. The boarding house stood at the northern end of the clearing, 3 stories of pine timber that had grayed to the color of old bones. It had been built to house unmarried quarrymen, 60 cots to a floor. As Crowe approached, he noticed the windows on the eastern side, the side that received the morning sun, had been boarded over from the outside, the nails driven through the frames with excessive force, bending the wood. The door was not locked. It swung inward on hinges that screamed like wounded animals. The smell hit him immediately. Not decay, there was nothing organic left to decay, but a compound odor of damp limestone, old urine, and the sharp metallic tang of broken stone. It was the smell of the quarry itself, trapped indoors for 31 months. Crowe's lantern revealed a scene of abrupt departure. Boots remained under cots. Plates sat on a long communal table, though whatever food they had held had long since turned to dust that mingled with the ubiquitous gray film. A jacket hung on a peg near the door, and in its pocket Crowe found a letter, half-written, dated February 28, 1889. The pen had dried mid-sentence. The writer, a man named Thomas Blackwood, had been describing a cough that brings up something heavier than blood. But it was the eastern wall that drew Crowe's attention. Unlike the other walls, which were pine boards nailed to studs, the eastern wall was paneled with beadboard, painted a deep green that had faded to the color of stagnant water. The baseboard was unusually thick, 6 inches of solid oak, and it sat crookedly against the floor, as if installed in haste. Crowe tapped it. The sound was hollow. He found the seam by following the draft. A section of the baseboard, approximately 3 feet wide, was not attached to the wall, but set before it like a plug. When he pried it loose with his surveyor's knife, he revealed a cavity no larger than a coffin stood on end, a space between the exterior stone foundation and the interior wall. Inside was a tin box, green with verdigris, and beside it a leather ledger bound in oilcloth. Crowe removed them. His hands were shaking, though the temperature in the room had dropped further, and his breath now clouded in thick white plumes. He opened the ledger first. The first page bore a title written in the same cramped hand as the note that had summoned him. The Pulmonary Study of Mercy Hollow Quarry Workers, a longitudinal analysis for insurance purposes. It was not a diary. It was a scientific record. The ledger contained 437 names, arranged alphabetically. Each entry began with a date of employment and a baseline vital capacity measured in pints. Then, week by week, the entries tracked the same measurement. Silas Crowe was not a medical man, but he was a man of numbers, and the pattern was unmistakable. Each worker began with a lung capacity of approximately 20 pints. Over the course of 18 months, the numbers descended with geometric precision. 18 pints, then 14, then 9. The final column, marked cessation, was not a date of death, but a date of land transfer. Next to each name, in the final column, was a property deed number, and below that, a price. Always exactly 1/3 of the assessed value of the land the worker had owned prior to entering Mercy Hollow. Crowe understood then, or began to. The silica dust that filled the air of the quarry, the silica that the workers inhaled with every breath, was not an unfortunate byproduct of the industry. It was the mechanism of the industry. Ezekiel Vance had discovered, through the corrupt medical examiner Dr. Abram Halloway, that silicosis worked slowly enough to allow for legal transactions, but surely enough to guarantee acquisition. The workers were not merely employees, they were investment vehicles. Vance took out life insurance policies on each man, industrial accident policies, underwritten by a Boston firm that asked no questions about remote Vermont quarries. Simultaneously, he advanced the men small loans against their homesteads, loans they could not repay once the sickness took their strength. When a man's lung capacity dropped below 5 pints, he became too weak to resist signing the quitclaim deed. When it dropped below 2, he died, officially of miner's consumption or catarrhal fever, and Vance collected the insurance, the land, and the mineral rights. The tin box contained the proof that elevated this from fraud to systematic murder. Inside were 34 death certificates, all signed by Dr. Halloway, all listing natural causes. Beneath them were the corrected assessments, autopsy notes, written in Halloway's private cipher, detailing the actual state of the lungs. Stone-filled, weight 4.2 pounds, normal lung weight 1.5 pounds, cause silicate pneumoconiosis. And finally, at the bottom of the tin box, a sheaf of telegrams between Vance and Sheriff Josiah Pike. The sheriff had known. He had enforced a quarantine on Mercy Hollow in January 1889, not to prevent disease from spreading, but to prevent the workers from leaving before the final land transfers could be notarized. The topographical instability that closed the town was a dynamite charge set off on March 1, 1889. The explosion served two purposes. It buried the evidence of the silica exposure under 200 tons of rubble, and it buried the 23 workers who were too sick to walk but still legally alive, men who had not yet signed their deeds, men who could have testified. The ledger recorded their names with a final notation: sealed in situ, claims cleared March 3, 1889. Crowe sat in the darkness of the boarding house for 3 hours, reading every name. He noted the specificity of the dates, how Vance had calculated the progression of the disease to coincide with the quarterly meetings of the land registry. He noted the children's names in the margins, children who had inherited claims that were immediately purchased by Vance's agents for the price of a coffin. He noted, with a surveyor's eye for detail, that the eastern wall of the boarding house had been built directly against the quarry face. The cavity where he had found the ledger was not a hiding place, it was a vent. The wall had been designed to channel the silica dust from the blasting site into the sleeping quarters, accelerating the exposure. They had not just worked the men to death, they had architecturally optimized the buildings to ensure the dust concentrations remained lethal but slow. Crowe left Mercy Hollow the following morning, carrying the ledger and the tin box. He walked the 17 miles to the nearest telegraph office in Plainfield, his boots crunching on frost-heaved stone. He sent 3 messages, one to the Attorney General in Montpelier, one to the Boston Herald, and one to his wife, telling her he would be delayed. He should have sent a 4th. The grand jury investigation, when it finally convened in December of 1891, found that Ezekiel Vance had died of apoplexy in November, 3 weeks after Crowe's discovery. Dr. Halloway had disappeared, presumed to have fled to Canada. Sheriff Pike produced affidavits from 17 witnesses, men who had never set foot in Mercy Hollow, swearing that the settlement had been abandoned due to an influenza outbreak and that the land purchases had been legitimate. The ledger was entered as evidence, then misplaced. The tin box was never entered into the record. Crowe testified for 6 hours, describing the cavity in the wall, the measurements of lung capacity, the precise mathematics of the fraud. The foreman of the jury, a granite merchant from Rutland, asked only one question. "Mr. Crowe, are you aware that challenging the integrity of Vermont's mining interests could destabilize the state's credit rating?" The jury returned a verdict of no criminal negligence in 20 minutes. Crowe was dismissed from the Railway Commission the following spring. His surveyor's license was not revoked. That would have implied he was wrong, but he was assigned to map swamp reclamation projects in the Champlain Valley, work that required him to stand in stagnant water for hours, breathing the miasma of rotting vegetation. He developed a cough in 1893. By 1895, he was listing his own lung capacity in his diary, watching the numbers descend with the same geometric precision he had seen in the Mercy Hollow ledger. He died in 1897, officially of catarrh fever. His widow received a death benefit of $40 from the Railway Commission. The ledger was found among his personal effects in 1952 when his grandson was cleaning out the attic of the house in Burlington. It was donated to the University of Vermont archives, where it remains today, uncatalogued in a box marked Industrial Ephemera 1880 to 1900. Mercy Hollow itself no longer exists on any map. In 1934, the Civilian Conservation Corps constructed a flood control dam on the stream that ran through the valley, creating a reservoir that covers the clearing to a depth of 40 feet. On autumn mornings when the water is still and the light strikes at a particular angle, local fishermen report seeing the outline of the boarding house beneath the surface, not the wreckage, but the shadow, sharp and distinct, as if the building refuses to dissolve. In drought years, when the water level drops, the eastern wall of the foundation becomes visible, and children from the surrounding towns sometimes swim down to touch the stones, returning to the surface with their hands coated in fine gray dust that smells of nothing and cannot be washed away. The forest has not reclaimed Mercy Hollow. The water has. And the water, being more patient and more indifferent than the trees, preserves what the land would have forgotten: the precise boundaries of a crime, measured not in chains and links, but in the slow, irreversible calculus of breath.